Hey everyone, how's it going? I hope you're all doing great and you're following the 3H's of the channel. In this video, it's all about the stories of a man's grandfather who was a policeman in Russia in the mid-90s. So you're definitely going to want to pull up a stump for this one. And thank you for watching. So, gentlemen, I've managed to find the cable for my cheap photo camera, and that means that it's time for some exciting tales. As I already said, my late grandpa served in the militia. This is a name for the police forces in the Soviet Union and many Warsaw Pact countries. In the Soviet Union until the very end of the 90s. To be more precise, he was an inspector in the sole militia station in a small town near Moscow. He was very tight-lipped. He was a solemn man, but when you asked him about his work, he usually became more talkative. In my opinion, work was the only thing that he loved in his life. So when I was younger, I was interested in paranormal things even back then. I spent a lot of evenings in his kitchen, inquiring about the most interesting cases of his career. After my grandfather died, I found a thick notebook that he apparently used as a diary of sorts that he kept in his personal cabinet. In that diary, there was a collection of his most, let's say, curious cases. I've managed to get this diary from my grandma a few times. Reading it, I was always thinking about my grandpa as some sort of mathematician. No literature style, no personal opinions, only confirmed cold facts. Such as a place where corpses were found, a criminologist's evaluation, suspects, and stuff like that. A few theories and a couple of notes. I think he kept working on these cases even in his free time, trying to solve these riddles. Most of his notes correlate with stories that he told me way back when I was a child, but there were also a few that I had never heard about. In case you suddenly enjoy some of these stories, I may even pay a visit to my grandma and ask her to let me flip through the pages of that diary, read up on some cases that I'm not familiar with, and make a few photos of the former scenes of crimes. Later, we can even try to guess what happened there. As I have said, I wanted to write some sort of book about those cases, so I will provide you with some photos that I already got with some additional notes, but don't expect all of my photos to be of exact crime scenes for obvious reasons. In some cases, I was too chicken to enter particular houses because neighborhoods here, as the town in general, are full of a certain criminal element, and if you enter some shitty hostel full of ex-cons and drug addicts, you might simply never leave it. And also, some of these places now have intercoms these days. I will also add that there will be no popobawas. These are an evil spirit from Zanzibar. That's also a bit of a meme on the Russian internet, because this name sounds funny in Russian. It comes out to something like ass joker. There's no colorful descriptions of monsters and stuff like that. Many cases have a serious mystical undertone, but with some imagination, you can probably explain them within a framework of habitual phenomena. But I can promise you that a bit of noir, dismemberment, and romantic of piss-stained staircases and apartment complexes. Oh yes, I would also ask you to not get all booty blasted about the quality of my photos. I'm no photographer, and instead of a proper camera, I have this digital one. Well, let's start. The first case that I want to tell you about happened in 1993, and it is particularly interesting because no one managed to explain exactly what happened here. I will add a few photos to this post. First has an apartment complex where it happened. Second, an exact place where a body was found. Second stairwell between the third and fourth floors if you absolutely must know. So, around 10 o'clock in the evening, an investigatory operative group in this small town, it consisted of just random regular cops, but usually had an investigator. They were called on a report of a discovery of a corpse, and this is what they saw on that staircase. A human body leaking a shitload of blood. head separated from the torso and lying not far away. Lacerations look as if someone had chewed him, according to my grandpa. His clothes, that consisted of training pants, sweater, and slippers, were torn in dozens of places. Also, some smaller injuries on his naked skin. It was instantly obvious that this corpse was fresh, which was confirmed by a criminologist on the scene. Rigor mortis had not set in yet, which indicated that less than 2 hours had passed since the moment of death. This was confirmed later during the interrogation of the victim's inconsolable widow, who lived on the 4th floor and whose door was like 3 meters from the body. By the way, she was the one who actually found and reported the corpse. The widow was clearly an alcoholic and had already had time to get wasted, but nonetheless, she did provide some information. Her husband left the flat at around 9:30 in the evening to take out some garbage. When 15 minutes passed, she started to worry that he decided to stop and chat with his drinking buddies, who usually sat near the entrance of the apartment complex, drinking. The windows of their flat provided no overview of the yard outside, if I recall correctly, so she decided to go downstairs herself and look for him. But the moment that she left her flat, she saw a disfigured body of her husband in a pool of blood. She failed to provide any more details during the later questionings. Now, for the interesting part. Interrogations of other inhabitants of that complex provided literally no additional information. Not a single one of them heard any ruckus, screams, or sounds of fighting. Nothing. And that is considering the shitty non-soundproof doors that people had back then. There was also indeed a bunch of drunkards sitting on a porch downstairs. According to them, they were hanging out there since around 8 in the evening, and in all that time, only some old lady who lived on the 1st floor and a single mother who lived on the 2nd entered the complex. By the way, my grandfather almost instantly suspected some sort of large dog. What else could dismember a person in such a manner in the middle of civilization? Later investigations revealed that there were 2 dog owners in that complex, but their dogs were small, and not nearly big enough to inflict such wounds, which was also later confirmed by the coroner. The head was indeed separated from the body, as if with the teeth of a large animal. His spine was literally grinded in places. Also, one of his legs had a very clear marking of jaws. According to the coroner, it looked very deliberate, as if left there very intentionally. Every single tooth of both lower and upper jaw left a clean mark, which almost never happens in normal coroner's practices. At least that one had never seen such a thing. The jaws indeed were similar to a dog's, but a really big one, and there were 48 of those teeth marks there, while normal dogs only have 42, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a bit less, but rarely and not by much. Now, a couple of my own comments. A large dog is indeed capable to separate a grown man's head from his body in 15 to 20 minutes. I can confirm this as the owner of a large dog. No, my dog has not killed anyone, but it can chew through a bone, a large one, in around 10 minutes. But there would be a lot of noise, shouting and screaming. If the dog were to somehow rip the guy's vocal cords on the first bite, there wouldn't be any shouts, but there would still surely be a struggle, which I guess is possible, considering the size of those jaws, but how could no one notice such a massive dog entering and exiting the apartment complex? Such animals tend to be remembered. Another strange thing is that blood was only found near the body. There was no blood on the stairs themselves, neither above or below, as if he was first put on the floor and then got his head calmly chewed off in silence. My dog attacked a homeless dog once, and there was a lot of blood. It was dripping from its jaws and its chest all the way home. And let me remind you, a human has much more blood than a dog. Nothing like that here. Everything was crispy clean. So we have something big that appeared on the staircase between floors, That house had no garbage chute, if you would like to entertain such a wild theory of its method of movement. Silently chewed through a grown man's head, left a dozen injuries on his body without any signs of resistance, and then disappeared. So it goes. Officially, the case was explained by a wild dog attack and then immediately closed down, not before informing all the local dog catchers that they should be on the lookout and do their job better in the future. This story also happened around 1993 in that same small town near Moscow. I tried and failed to Google anything about it, and I've never heard anyone discussing it here in this town, so I guess there's no reason to give away the name, to be quite honest. My Gramps worked in local militia, as I mentioned, and I asked him about that case many times, so I guess I didn't completely imagine it, even though I was like 4 years old back then, and my memories are a little bit foggy. Back then, young women started to disappear in our town. Absolutely normal girls, not some criminal's girlfriends or anything, according to my grandpa. In a single month, 6 of them disappeared. And then the 7th was lost. Her father was a trainer in a local boxing club, popular with both sportsmen and local thugs. From a whole bunch of his clients and friends who were willing to help him, he created some sort of militia patrol aimed at looking for his daughter and preventing similar abductions in the future. This militia started to stroll around the neighborhood in small groups, and one night I woke up from some loud noises from the outside. I ran to my window, and I saw my mother and father standing there, looking at a bunch of guys who were trying to widen some tiny cellar window that was right under mine, the first floor, with sledgehammers. Now for some facts from my Gramps. Guys from one of those patrols saw 3 men carrying something big toward that cellar. They immediately ran after them, but those 3 guys have managed to close the heavy steel cellar door before they were caught. Later, I learned that they had also built a barricade from some garbage lying inside when they realized that the guys from the militia were not joking. So the militia guys called on all the others and broke into the basement through that window, where they found those 3 crazy guys armed with knives and a girl's already dismembered body. I know now that there was also a handwritten book in an unknown language. It was later stolen right from the evidence box. A hacksaw for metal and a dog's skull. Walls and the floor were covered in some symbols written in chalk, which were mostly destroyed under the feet of 24 boxers who entered that basement, but nothing of value was lost. By the time the cops arrived, those 3 guys were already heavily beaten by the boxers. 2 of them were crippled for life. 1 actually died. Few boxers received some superficial cuts. Interrogation by a raging father gave no results, same as the latter interrogations by the militia. Many traces of blood were found in that basement, though, from different people and from a long period of time. As you can expect, no bodies were found, even through search parties that combed through every neighborhood and nearby forest. The 2 survivors kept their silence. Come to think of it, those guys were some sort of screwed in the head. They believed in necromancy and all that, and they even managed to hide those bodies very well. Imagine what a smarter person with no mental issues could do. I just stumbled upon those photos, so I guess I'll tell you about them. I have to warn you that some people may not find it too scary, but this case always captivated me. There's something about it. Also, when I once saw some tiny lights in that woods at night, I figuratively shat my pants. It will be longer than the first one, but do prepare yourselves, for I have no idea how long the third one will be either. It happened in the winter of 1995. One evening, around 8 o'clock, a strange visitor came to a local militia station, a priest of the local church, which, by the way, happens to be in the middle of nowhere. He came to report threats that he had been receiving for some time now. The priest brought a bunch of the notes with him. They were handwritten on torn notebook pages in crooked block letters. They were written with a bunch of mistakes that the desk cop on duty had a field day with that night. But he didn't laugh for long. According to the priest, he regularly received these notes in his mailbox. First, every 3 days. Later, every day. Which was the reason he decided to finally report them. After being asked if he wanted to add something else to the report, he hesitantly added that he had recently started to hear the sound of slaps in his apartment, as if someone was slapping linoleum in his corridor and kitchen with bare hands, very distinctly. When asked if he actually checked what it was, he answered that he was too scared to leave his room, and he just prayed to God, hoping for his protection. He was clearly worried that people would think that he was just insane, and people at the station indeed thought so, but his report was officially accepted nonetheless. It was a busy period for the militia, and since the priest didn't look well in the head, the case and those notes were forgotten for a time. Around a week later, an investigatory operative group gets a call. In the forest around 2 to 250 meters deep, a body was found, and not just some body, but as you have probably guessed, the body of that very priest. State of that corpse was pretty terrible. Almost all of the muscle tissue on his hands and legs was missing. The body was covered in livor mortis and blemishes. Facial features were distorted by the rot. He was only recognized so quickly thanks to his cross, which was the only element of clothes on him, long hair and a beard. Later, it was concluded that he had died 7.5 to 8 days before the discovery. Additionally, his body clearly was kept indoors for some time, since it wouldn't have rotted so much in the winter frost. It was confirmed by the elderly guy who found the body, since he used to walk with his dog every day on that same route in this forest, and he only discovered the body that morning. Also, which was especially bizarre, many prints that were found around the body looked like the prints of human hands. They didn't just look like handprints, they were handprints. It was just effing ridiculous at that point, quoting my grandfather. There was a trail of such prints leading around the forest. Strangely enough, not on the clear trail, but around it, in the snowdrifts. There was no evidence of any body being dragged. All the other prints belonged to that elderly guy and cops. The previous night, there was a serious snowfall, which would have covered the tracks, so the body clearly wasn't there for long, and it clearly didn't appear there by itself. Questionings of the elderly guy, residents of the nearby houses, and guards of a garage cooperative close by didn't clarify much, though the elderly guy kept nagging about finding corpses of animals on that glade, dogs, cats, rats, crows, and such. He reported it to militia many times, but nothing was done about it. He had to bury the animals himself. He also just had to share his theory about Satanists with the investigators. The place itself was far away from anything. The closest houses were like 600 to 700 meters away, same as the garage cooperative. No cars stopped nearby. No mysterious people were seen there, not even ordinary people with a big bag or a parcel. Literally nothing. And that's when someone remembered about the notes. Earlier notes were rather simplistic, basically threats like, reject your faith or we will kill you. But those that came later were more interesting. Take off your cross, or you will feed the hungry one with yourself. My grandfather quoted from memory. There was more, but he didn't recall what those were about, sadly. All of them had a bunch of mistakes, as I already stated. No handwriting expertise was done to my knowledge, but these notes were quickly given away to experts in order to check for fingerprints while the investigators decided to visit the priest's flat. The door wasn't closed, though there were no signs of forced injury. Remembering the priest's words about the slaps on the floor, The linoleum in his corridor kitchen was checked without much hope for fingerprints, but it was a sudden success. A few clear fingerprints, huge fingers that were certainly not the priest's. The fingers looked like they belonged to some hammerer or a smith, according to my grandfather. Other than that, everything in his flat looked in order. All of the valuables, the icons, were still there, but there was no way to know for sure since that priest lived alone and had no relatives. He was an orphan. In short, fingerprints on the notes were identical to those on the floor, but neither the local militia station nor the bigger regional archive had those prints in their databases. Meanwhile, the coroner report stated that muscles in his hands and legs were not eaten by animals, but they were neatly removed with surgical accuracy. It was done either using a scalpel or a very small and very sharp knife. No additional wounds were found on his body. No traces of known poisons were found either. The militia had to start questioning members of the priest's church parish. He wasn't seen there since the day he reported the death threats to the local station. The obvious conclusion was that he disappeared after visiting it, since it happened after the evening service, so it happened either at his way home or at his flat. This is all considering that he was found in the open. Questioning his neighbors revealed that he probably didn't come home that day. One old lady even came to his door around 9 in the evening to ask for some life advice, but no one opened. She didn't hear any suspicious sounds or see any suspicious people either. It seemed to be a complete dead end. All of the local invalids were checked, just in case. Investigators really tried to somehow work that strange handprint angle. At first, they started to check those who lived nearby. After Chechnya and Afghanistan, there were many. By the end of it, they had checked almost all the town's invalids, but found no fingerprint matches. They didn't really expect any results at that point, to be honest, so they just wrote it off to probable local cultists, which was really easy to do back then because of the story that happened when I was a child. Even those 2 guys that were caught years ago were questioned, but to no avail. Maybe it was their friends doing something, but I doubt it, since the modus operandi seems to be too different. Of course, if the priest wasn't largely ignored when he came to the station, he probably could have told them something else, and that info may have resulted in a solved case, but we have what we have, and it really smells of some sort of mysticism, in my opinion. And here's another photo of that place, made at around 11 in the evening. Those little lights that I told you about at the beginning. Zooming in didn't result in anything, and the flash on my camera was so bright that I got scared and decided to leave in case I was seen by someone. Not that I am a coward, but you know, that forest becomes really creepy when you know the story. The lights are around the place where the glade is. Those are certainly not cigarette lights, too far away to be seen so clearly. Possibly small campfires, possibly even motorcycle lights, since there is no way to get a car there. It remains a mystery. So gentlemen, let's go further. There probably won't be much paranormal sounding stuff in this one, since the real question here is not how someone would do this, but why would someone do this? Let's go. It happened in 1991, which was a hard time. Levels of apathy and general unprofessionalism in Russia were off the charts back then, which played a role in this case. No one was sure about tomorrow and the future of their country. It all began with a call from a very bad address for a very shitty reason. Apartment complexes where it all happened can be seen in the photo that I add here. For as long as I can remember, this particular place was considered bad and dangerous. But not because it had ghosts or something like that, of course. The reason was much simpler. It was a former dorm that in those times was filled with people from the very bottom of society. Robberies, knifings, and murders happened there regularly. Even I had a chance to see local, so to say, customs personally when I was a kid. I was riding my bicycle nearby when a human head flew out of some window and landed 30 meters away from me. According to the rumors, some drug addicts had an argument. But anyway, I'm just telling this so that you would better understand what kind of atmosphere that place had and why I didn't go inside to take some photos. Getting back on the topic, in one of the flats on the second floor, a family was murdered. Said family consisted of a single mother, her 7-year-old daughter, and as we found out later, a year-old infant. They were extremely poor, and according to the old lady living next door, the mother held no job, drank non-stop, and often brought some suspicious men home. The daughter was practically homeless and never went to any sort of kindergarten or school. How did an infant manage to survive in such a family is unclear. According to my grandpa, you should divide anything those old Soviet grannies say by 2 if you want to get closer to the truth, but it all looked shitty nonetheless. The door was slightly ajar, which allowed for bodies to be found, and as for bodies, at the first glance, it looked like a typical case of domestic violence, with some excessive force though. Around 30 knife wounds on each body. The wounds were at least 2 days old. The criminology expert's theory was that those wounds were inflicted on already dead bodies. The mother was killed in the kitchen. Signs of a struggle were all around. Furniture was overturned. The fridge handle was torn off. Dishes were broken. A bottle of uncharacteristically expensive vodka and some rotting delicacies were picturesquely lying on the cheap, dilapidated table. The daughter, it looked like, was killed in her sleep. Because she was found in her bed in an embryo pose, there were no signs of resistance. As for the infant, no trace of him was found, except for a baby fence in his sister's room. The infant's very existence was only corroborated by that same old lady and later by other neighbors. No diapers, no baby food, no stroller, no birth certificate, nothing, which is, considering the social status of that family, possible. But even the surface search of the apartment revealed a lot of interesting things. Not only was the freezer chock full of expensive food and alcohol, there was also a large sum of money hidden in the icebox. Literally a few packs of money hidden inside cheap wrappings, which was a normal way to hide money and valuables from possible robbers in those days. But what were they doing there in the apartments of these piss-poor people? That raised some questions, because the connection between those valuables and deaths was obvious. Further questionings of the neighbors and local alcoholics in the yard clarified 3 important things. First of all, the murdered woman was popular here, if you know what I mean, and her door was usually open. Second, according to a score of witnesses, a strange man started to visit her in the last week. He clearly wasn't local, and even though descriptions slightly varied from witness to witness, they painted a certain picture. Uncertain age, completely bald head, always in the same 3-piece brown suit, patent leather shoes, and a bow tie. In short, he looked like he was loaded with some dough. No one could provide investigators with any distinctive details of his physical appearance, or even his face. Such people rarely, if ever, visited this place, and it is a whole separate question as to why didn't anyone try to rob or just beat him up, because that kind of people were not too popular in that house, to say the absolute least. Many people saw him entering the apartment complex in victim's flat, but nobody ever saw him leave. Another thing was the suspect's interesting and unusual manner of speech. According to people who talked to him, he was florid, artsy, old-fashioned, and extremely polite. Sadly, no one could quite recall what the man asked them about, although the witnesses could recall that he had some questions, which wasn't completely unusual in such places, since the inhabitants were usually drunk or something. He was seen at least 3 times in the last week, though by the time the militia arrived, he wasn't seen there for 3 days straight. And finally, the third and important piece of info. The moment this man started to come to this apartment complex, the victim stopped receiving visitors, and her flat, for the first time in years, fell silent. No shouts, no loud noises, no baby cries. So yes, the infant's existence was finally corroborated by the accounts of most witnesses, but no one remembered the dead woman ever being pregnant. Bodies then were brought to a coroner. When they were loading them into the car, it looked as if every bone in those bodies was broken, basically behaved like a couple of rag dolls. Further searches of the apartment didn't provide investigators with any additional details. No signs of forced entry, no traces of blood, except for those of the victims. The bottle of vodka and glasses on the table were, of course, checked for fingerprints, but only prints that belonged to the victim were found. Doorknobs in her flat gave such a wild range of different fingers that experts exhausted themselves to no end just trying to compare every set with what they had in their databases. In any case, almost all fingerprints belong to the local lowlives who haven't seen her for at least 2 weeks. Now, coroner's report was much more interesting. Indeed, injuries on the bodies were inflicted when the victims were already dead for around a day at that point. But this is not the interesting thing. The autopsy showed that every bone in their bodies, except for the skull and cervical vertebrae, became extremely brittle and were basically damaged by who knows what. They certainly weren't broken by the blunt trauma, since there were no traces of such damage on the bodies themselves, not to mention that it would be very tiring of a process, breaking every tiny bone in a human body. Also, the bodies would look like a couple of torn bloody bags after that. Damage that was dealt to the bones reminded the local militia expert of the effects of highly concentrated hydrofluoric acid, but there were 2 big problems with this theory. First, hydrofluoric acid of such a concentration would have left extreme chemical burns. Considering all the bones that were damaged, they would have to take a bath in that acid to achieve such an effect, but there were no surface traces of that. Second, this acid leaves a chemical bouquet in a human body that tests would have surely identified. The only irregular thing about their bones was a critical lack of calcium, and that was that. At the same time that the tests were conducted, a call came from one of the witnesses interrogated earlier. He saw the suspect entering a boiler house near the apartment complex. Not wasting any time, my grandfather got 2 operatives and moved out. The door to that boiler house territory was indeed open. Whether it was lockpicked by the suspect or just left unclosed by sloppy workers was never found out, but according to all regulations, that door had to be locked. On the photo, you can see that very boiler house. Forgive me for not trying to go inside. There is an actual lock hanging there now, and trying to climb over the concrete walls with barbed wire is not my idea of fun. So, Grandpa went there and met 2 middle-aged women working inside. By the way, there was supposed to be 5 or 6 personnel working at all times, according to regulations. This is probably the reason why something blew up inside there when I was a kid. They were noticeably twitchy and were not normal, as if they were terrified. When questioned about the suspect, they nervously laughed and denied any knowledge about him. To quote my grandpa, the way they tried to bullshit me was pretty cartoonish. But at that point, my Gramps didn't really care about them too much. He just left one of his operatives there to watch the main entrance, and the 2 women. The other one of his subordinates he took with him to more effectively conduct a search of the area. By the way, the building was pretty screwed up. It was very old and multi-tiered, so everywhere there was moisture, rust, and only 1 out of every 10 light bulbs was working, so they had to get flashlights. In the far corner of that building, one that probably no one visited for years, a baby's loose jacket was found, hanging between the interweaving pipes. Grandpa and his subordinates started to frantically search everywhere in the area. They literally looked under every single pipe in that building, but found nothing. Even the criminology expert who arrived later had no luck with the fingerprints or any prints whatsoever. The baby's jacket had no traces of blood on it, or any other traces at all for that matter. It looked so clean, as if it was just recently washed. The two women were called later for questioning. One of them kept stating that she saw or knew nothing, and the other disappeared after the very first interrogation. As her melancholic drunkard of a husband said later, she just left home without packing any of her belongings. Despite all the numerous questions the militia asked her husband and colleague, despite checking all possible connections, nothing gave any result. For all intents and purposes, those women were completely normal. Even their fingerprints were taken and compared to those found in the victim's flat, but this naturally ended with failure. At that point, the case came to a grinding halt, and it seemed that there was nowhere left to dig. But then suddenly, a month later, another call came from the same apartment complex, from the same old lady who found the bodies. According to her, faint sounds of crying were heard coming from the now sealed apartment where the murders took place. An operative investigatory group answered the call. My Gramps told me that he almost physically felt surrealism of the situation. Sealed door of the dead apartment had no signs of forced injury, and Gramps indeed heard a faint sound of a baby crying inside. It took them half an hour to get inside the apartment, and indeed, an infant was found in there. Only, he had no eyes. I mean, there was no blood or anything, just no eyes. As was later found out, they were surgically removed from the sockets. A thin layer of pink skin was covering places where eyes should have been, with tiny scars marking them, as if after plastic surgery. No injuries or pathologies beyond that were found. If you were curious about his fate, he was brought to a children's hospital, then to an orphanage for infants. I don't know what happened to him later, but I suggest he had a very unhappy life, though I am curious if anything else has ever happened to him. So it goes, gentlemen. I am tired as all hell typing this, but I will add my grandpa's theory and a couple of my own thoughts nonetheless. His theory was that the infant was basically bought from his alcoholic mother by that guy in a three-piece suit, but something went wrong with the deal and led to him killing the mother and the daughter as a witness. The method of murder itself is much less clear. Let's suppose knife wounds were either a way to lead the investigation on the wrong path, though the murderer seemed too clever to think that they would fool the experts, considering that he clearly knew how not to leave any traces of his presence, or mask a way that bone-damaging substance can enter the body. Though the injuries on both bodies seemed very random, some parts of the bodies were covered with injuries, while others remained untouched. And again, experts had no idea what kind of poison could have such an effect without leaving any traces. The next thing, who would leave such a large sum of money to a corpse? There really was an F-load of money in there, and only some poor woman who drank away her brains could think that no one would find them. But the fact is a fact. Money was there. How to tie it in with those two women from the boiler house, I have no idea. By the way, the one that left never came back. My grandpa often returned to this case and checked for any new information about her possible whereabouts. I guess someone managed to scare them really good. But there is no way to know now, really, and I have no idea what that baby jacket was doing there as well. Next, the infant. Where did the victim get him? Was he stolen? Left on her doorstep? Scars from such things as eye removal don't heal in a mere month, as you might know. Was it some other baby? But how? And why? Also, those who saw the child before all this happened stated that he had a birthmark on the right side of his forehead. The baby with no eyes had the exact same birthmark. I guess getting inside the sealed apartment wasn't much of a challenge, since the killer may have had the keys. But even without all that, I think there are many mysterious things about this story. That's it. And first of all, I have to disappoint you, because the most paranormal story will have to be reserved for later. I didn't pick the best of times to go out and make photos. Not only I almost shat my pants because of some creepy dude there, but also the visibility was awful. However, a few of those photos will fit another story quite nicely. Use your imagination to envision the locals I'm going to tell you about, because some of these places are too far away, too creepy, or in some cases don't exist anymore. Still, I think you will find this case to your liking. Here it goes. It's 1992. The country is still shaken. My grandpa is still serving in the militia of our town. One day, a weird guy comes to his station, acting all awkward and shy, obviously nervous. According to Grandpa, he looked like a drunken bum in dirty, torn clothes. Despite his looks, though, he had both a proper passport and a legal address. In short, he told him this: in one of the farthest and worst parts of town that consisted of a garage cooperative and an abandoned train depot. You can see the train depot gates in the first photo. I have no idea why it glows green, but I guess it looks amusing. His friends started to go missing. By the way, I have no idea why that depot is even there. I have never seen a single train on those screwed up tracks in my life. Those people were not just some random guys, but true-to-life vagabonds who had some sort of spot where they hid from people's eyes. Also, there was scrap and copper reception points nearby. Selling stolen scrap and copper was an integral part of survival for many bums back in the early 90s. That explains why they sent an emissary, basically, who actually had some sort of legal papers instead of one of their own, because no one wanted to spend their night at the, quote, monkey house, a slang term for a cell that houses drunks and bums, or used as a scapegoat to help the militia come close to day cases, which was regrettably quite widespread of a practice back then. As he explained, something strange was happening there. Just 3 days ago, one of the bums walked away from the bonfire to take a piss and just never came back. About 30 minutes later, his friends lit some sticks and went looking for him with those improvised torches. You never know, he may have fallen asleep in a ditch or something. But despite all their efforts, they failed to locate their friend. Although drunk bums are not really good at nocturnal search operations, let's be honest here. Their friend didn't come back the next day, or the day after that either. They didn't think much about it, especially because a full bottle of vodka went missing that night too, which apparently was a commodity valuable enough for them to justify their friend's sudden flight. He didn't take any of his actual stuff with him, so they were waiting for him to come back, ready to kick his ass. But on the next night, another one went missing, under much more frightening circumstances. Similarly, one of them walked away from the bonfire to take a leak, but as soon as he left the circle of light provided by it, he entered the bushes. He let out a terrifying scream that was abruptly cut short. This prompted other bums to action as they rushed to his rescue, but at that moment, according to the emissary, they heard some sort of growl, which made them stop in their tracks. He didn't see much himself, because no one thought to prepare torches for such an occasion, but some of his friends claimed to see a, quote, scary person who was grinning at them from the darkness, barely dissipated by the weak light of their bonfire. To cut the long story short, they got really scared and went back to their bonfire, not daring to go to sleep until morning. At that point, the bums were forced to take extreme measures and ask for help from one of their sworn enemies, the militia. Legally speaking, the militia had no basis to reject this report, so it was accepted, discussed during the smoke break, and promptly dismissed as mad homeless ravings or some sort of prank. The cops had enough on their plate already, but the next disappearance forced them to ponder and act. One of the town's citizens disappeared. A simple regular guy who liked to drink and drive around in his car in his free time. According to his wife, he was generally a responsible family guy who never left for a long time without warning. But 2 days have passed, and there was no sign of him. By the way, I have no idea why she didn't report his disappearance after the first 24 hours had passed. And the last place where he was seen was, you've guessed it, that very same garage cooperative, the one that was situated near the bum's spot. This was where he left his car and went home using the familiar and shortest route, an old railway track. Connecting his disappearance with those of the bums was, of course, an obvious thing to do. As you can see in the photos, the forest closely surrounds the tracks from both sides. The other direction is a similar situation, except there is a bridge there, and you can see in the photo that I decided not to climb that bridge because I saw a corpse lying there in my childhood, which didn't leave me with a lot of pleasant memories. The corpse itself is not interesting. It's a typical story of the late 90s. After the bridge, there is more forest, and on the right and concrete wall on the left, separating the railway from the old warehouses. They were almost all abandoned back then, and by the mid-2000s they were demolished. After that, some sort of building materials market was constructed there, but by now, it's abandoned too. I guess this place just has such a fate. And so it goes like that for 1.5 kilometers until it reaches more or less civilized areas of town. At first, they suspected the bums themselves, obviously. But on the other hand, if any of them was guilty, he would have run away after their, quote, emissary informed the police. But one operative was sent to question them anyways. Although either he was a dumbass or the bums left their usual place because he couldn't find anyone. Meanwhile, my grandfather took a group of subordinates and went to visit these old warehouses, which were the obvious place to hide potential bodies. Besides, at that point in time, there wasn't even a single security guard working there. Skipping the boring details, what they found was a checkered shirt with some traces of blood that, according to the missing guy's wife, was on him when he left home. In addition, there was a lot of various trash and a couple of mattresses. The room they found them in was relatively clean too, in comparison to the rest of the warehouse. Experts immediately detected some fingerprints there, and that's where a certain surprise awaited them. It was revealed that the fingerprints belonged to 2 convicts who escaped from some prison near Solokamensk a whole 15 years ago and were largely forgotten about by that point. By the way, they were imprisoned for some pretty heavy stuff. One of them was local. The other one used to live in Moscow. The local one was a 62-year-old at that point. The one from Moscow, 41. The next logical step was to check the address where the local convict used to live. His flat was on the first floor in a pretty bad part of town. The apartment complex itself was in a critical state. It had been demolished by now, and the flat itself belonged to the town's housing fund for some reason. The convict would have gotten quite surprised if he chose to return home legally, I bet. But no one lived there anyway. It turned out that getting the keys wasn't a problem, since a door, a piece of plywood, was already broken into and the lock was torn out. Inside the apartment, or to be more precise, inside its bathroom, they found, without any exaggeration, pandemonium. The first traces of blood were found on the floor and walls of the corridor, and in the bathroom itself there was a bath full of body parts, belonging to 3 people in total, though the heads and torsos were never found, as far as I know. Apparently, they were chopped up with an axe that also wasn't ever found either. Those parts floated in dirty, cold water. No idea where they get it, since the water supply to that flat was cut off long ago. The stench of decomposition and feces was horrible. The toilet was covered in excrements. The neighbors didn't contact the police, which was understandable, since nobody lived on the first 3 floors, except for an ancient blind gaffer from the second. The kitchen had a portable gas stove, a big tin can with traces of blood on it, a half-full bag of potatoes, and a pile of human bones just laying in the corner. This is when the realization hit the operatives. The cons whose fingerprints were found everywhere around the apartment were eating those people. I have no idea why or for what reason. I mean, you can just steal food like those potatoes, but they were eating them. Everything pointed to this conclusion. Questioning the other tenants didn't give investigators anything new to go on. Those few who still lived there, less than 10 people in total, unanimously claimed that they had never seen any unfamiliar men there. But that blind old man said that the night before the cops paid a visit, someone was trying to force themselves into his apartment for a few hours straight, but to no avail. The case was turning more and more serious by the minute. 2 operatives were left in the apartment to lay ambush, while my grandfather went straight to the prosecutor's office, demanding them to involve the federals, because this case was clearly out of his league, and he knew only too well who would have to answer for all this shit if it turned even more serious. The case was taken away from him surprisingly fast. Almost no one there even tried to argue with him. 2 operatives who spent the night in the flat almost went mad from stench and disgust. They were freed from their unpleasant duty, though the murderers never returned to their apartment anyways. Everyone involved was thoroughly questioned by the feds. Grandpa himself and his immediate superiors got their asses kicked for their sloppiness, but no one lost their office or got demoted. Who took this case over, what info I have left, could be classified as rumors told to you during the smoke breaks. But if you start to tell the story, you have to finish it, even though I don't know all the details. The perpetrator's tracks were found not far from town, near a big forest that stretches for dozens of kilometers. There was a place there called The Lodge, even though it was, in fact, more of a country house cooperative, consisting of something around 40 houses. My guess, the call came from there. The federals failed to apprehend both of them, and here's why. They were already pursuing them through the woods, when suddenly they stumbled upon the older one, lying on the ground, grinning like a madman. Apparently, his friend broke his leg with something very heavy and proceeded to escape alone. He was dragged to a car and interrogated, but no one managed to squeeze a single word out of him. He just kept whining and growling like an animal. The younger one was never found, even though a search party combed through the whole forest with dogs. The older con kept whining and shaking all the way to the precinct, but at one point fell silent. It turned out he managed to gnaw his own tongue off. The doctors managed to save his life again according to rumors. He proved uncooperative, was officially recognized as insane, and got locked away in some specialized asylum for the rest of his days. Neither I nor my grandpa could vouch for a single word in the previous part, as you can understand, but there is only one proper version of events. No mysteries here. 2 escaped convicts were screwing around somewhere for 15 whole years and managed to get from Ural to Moscow. They probably went through a lot in their travels, and at some point they were forced to eat someone to avoid death from hunger, maybe another bum, or just some random tourist. Apparently, this experience took a heavy toll on them psychologically, and they acquired a taste for human meat. After that, they switched to a new menu, slowly turning more and more into a couple of animals, if the older one was any indication. And only here in the Moscow region they became bolder and ate someone who would be searched for, because finding them basically wasn't that hard. But there is another factor. They had an almost animal-like sense of danger, always managing to outplace Malizia's pursuit by just a day or 2. That's it. By the way, it was really creepy taking those photos, especially knowing that one of them is still on the run, even though he must be extremely old today. Those locals are now as far away from any proper civilization as it was back then. Also, I would never want to be in the shoes of that blind old man during that night. This part of the story has always chilled me to the bone. And I have one final one for you. This happened during the summer of 1996. This case differs from the previous ones because firstly, it happened in a good part of town, in which I lived, by the way, and secondly, because I heard part of this story firsthand, even before my grandpa told me about it. One night, around 1 a.m., a man burst into my grandpa's precinct, raving like a lunatic and holding a crying woman in a torn dress. After managing to calm him down, 2 officers on duty started to listen to his story. He, a 32-year-old small-time businessman, was visited by some friends that evening, and they asked his wife, a 27-year-old housewife, to take their kid, an 8-month-old boy, and go for a stroll around the block. What kind of visit, from what kind of friends, makes you ask your wife to take your child and leave the house at 11 p.m. is a separate question, and some investigators tried to tie the visit to what happened next, and had certain success with it, after running some checks on those, quote, friends, who had pretty evident connections to a big local gang. He clearly paid them protection money, since both he and his business were doing fine, but I'll come back to it later. After around 1 hour and 10 minutes, he finally managed to get rid of his friends and started to worry about his wife, who hasn't come back yet. When he came out of the house, he couldn't see her anywhere and started to circle their apartment complex, shouting her name, when suddenly he literally stumbled upon the overturned stroller lying there in the dark. The stroller was lying on an asphalt road. There were no lanterns on that road back then, and there are none today. The closest ones are something like 30 meters away, near the walkway that goes along the edge of a forest. So yeah, you can't see anything there at night. When he realized that the stroller was empty, he started to seriously panic. But then, he heard sobbing coming from the forest and rushed toward it, where he found his wife, weeping and wandering between the trees in a nigh unconscious state. Failing to get any sort of response from her, he just put her in his car and drove toward the precinct. My grandpa had nearly as much success. She was answering slowly. She couldn't even recall her own name at first. She was clearly in a state of shock, so a doctor was called in immediately. But something my grandfather did learn by basically asking her the same questions over and over again. To sum her incoherent speech up, this is what happened. She was walking along that very same road when something big rushed toward her from the direction of the apartment complex. It pushed her away, grabbed her child from a stroller, and ran towards a, quote, iron tower, and then into the woods. She followed this something into the forest, but failed to catch up with it. And yes, this is exactly how she called it, something that my grandfather remembered very well. After that, there was a theory about a big animal, but I'll tell you about it later. The doctor, who arrived by then, examined her, finding bruises and small scratches that she probably received while pursuing the abductor through the woods. No further damage was found, but she was indeed in a state of shock. The doctor advised to give her some glycine or glycerol. I don't know what I have written in my notes there, so don't harass me about it, and let her have some sleep, and advised her to avoid stress. He chastised my grandfather for questioning her in such a state. He also advised to hospitalize her if her condition wouldn't improve on the next day. It was decided, without much hope, to conduct a search. Of course, while the trail was hot, with the help of a kynologist and his dog, the iron tower was found pretty fast. 250 meters away from the spot the stroller was found, there was an overhead power line, which you can see in the attached photo. During the examination of the stroller, some strange things started to happen. The dog, a long-haired German shepherd, a huge male, saw that dog a few times in my childhood, and it was indeed enormous. The dog started to act erratic, growling at the house, pressing its tail, ignoring the kynologist's commands, who was pretty surprised by that behavior from an adult dog that never acted like that before. He was the one who proposed a theory about a large wild animal may have caused the dog, unfamiliar with hunting, to react that way. On the fabric that covered the stroller, there was a small torn gap no one paid much attention to. After all, it could have been torn during its fall on the asphalt, covered in small pebbles and pieces of broken glass. But my grandfather noted this anyway. Maybe he had some thoughts about it. There were no traces of blood that were found inside the stroller or on the ground around it. They even double-checked it during the day, and nothing. But the stroller was taken for an expertise anyways, which gave no results. When they finally reached the tower, despite the dog acting completely inadequate and outright refusing to pick up the trail, they started to ponder what to do next. There were no obvious tracks. The dog wasn't helping. So, the chronologist was dismissed, while the other operatives started to rummage through the nearest part of the forest with flashlights, just to clear their conscience, but to no avail. In the morning, they had called the man whose child had gone missing, but he had reported that his wife had not become better and that he was taking her to a hospital. She was sent to the loony bin for some time, but even after getting released, she couldn't tell anything new, as if she'd totally lost her memory. There was only one connection left, the man's friends. But not to turn all this into one of the boring episodes of Criminal Russia, which was once a popular TV show documenting all kinds of crimes. In brief, it did not lead anywhere, and look for yourself. The businessman was small time, and to put it mildly. And what's so strange and scary about this story, might you think? The fact that in a month's time, the same house had seen a similar case. Two brothers, the elder was 10, the younger was 7, played behind the house and rummaged under the windows, hoping to find something interesting. The elder brother, naturally, was tasked by the parents to keep an eye on Junior. The rest is taken from the elder brother's testimony after his father had taken him to the militia. It was a short while before 10 p.m., time to return home, when the older brother had suddenly noticed that the younger brother was standing still and staring into a dark alcove under the first-floor balcony. The elder brother tried calling the kid several times, but he did not react. Setting on his way to him, he froze in place when, quote, fur-covered paws appeared out of the alcove and dragged the child inside, and the kid did not make a single sound. How he managed to see fur on the paws in the dark is an interesting question, as there are no streetlights there. At first, the guy stood dead still and peered into the darkness. For a moment, he even thought he had seen big white eyes, and then dashed off as fast as he could back home to his father, who was sipping beer after a long day's work, and he, having smacked the lad for lying, went looking for the younger son with a flashlight. He had examined every alcove, but did not find anything at all, except a hole punched in the corner of one of them, which probably led to the basement of the house. But that hole was too narrow for any adult man. Only a child could get through it. But the father wasn't intent to give up so easily. He took a crowbar and busted the lock on the basement door and climbed down there. Unfortunately, having gone through the entire basement, he found nothing. There was a strong stink of rot that was verified by my grandfather, who examined the cellar later, and something else in the air, a strange, almost heavy smell. But in the end, nothing was found. And that's all, folks. The funny thing is, I knew that boy from my childhood. We were in the same crowd. He was slightly older than me, and the story that he told to the cops is near a perfect fit for the story he told us after all those events. He was never a particularly merry fellow and soul of the company, but after those events he barely went out. He became somewhat fearful and almost panicked when faced with the backside of his own house, a flat-out refusing to go there. So on one hand, I personally believe it, but on the other, who knows what story a child can concoct. But there is the matter of the woman's account, who again was in a state of shock and thus made a shitty witness, and of a guard dog who would put its tail between its legs like a little puppy, which is highly atypical. The animal version is doubtful, I'd say. Firstly, what kind of animal likes to snatch little kids without leaving any tracks? Seriously, 2 similar cases in the same place, and in a whole month, nobody saw anything. And secondly, if we take into account the hole leading to the cellar, no large animal could fit into it. There are, of course, the man's friends from the first case, but as I said, there doesn't seem to be any sense in it for them, since the second man had nothing to do neither with commerce or with crime, and it would make more sense to steal both children, I reckon. So truth be told, I have no ideas to share about this one. And if you enjoyed all these, then feel free to subscribe to my channel. If you would like to support the channel, I have a PayPal and a Patreon in the description below. And with that, I thank you for pulling up a stump, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.